Hello, everybody, and welcome to Source Intelligence's Approaching Modern Day Slavery, Using Your Existing Compliance Data to Create a Robust Anti-Human Trafficking Program. My name is Jay Sailing, and I will be the moderator for today's broadcast. I'm really happy to say that we've gathered an exceptional group of speakers to be with us today to talk about insights in regards to data management, key risk indicators, and best practices in regards to developing a corporate-level modern-day slavery compliance program. So I'd like to start things off by diving into today's agenda. We'll begin with a brief overview of the regulatory environment surrounding modern-day slavery. We will then hear from Kilian Moote as he details Know the Chain's industry-specific approach to risk mitigation and key areas of risk to look at in your supply chain. Kristen Sullivan will then give us an in-depth summary of some critical program components of a corporate modern-day slavery program. Kristen will then outline how to approach modern-day slavery by looking at your existing compliance programs and data. Source Intelligence's very own Jennifer Kraus will then take over as she will talk about trends in data management and outline the most fundamental driver of modern-day slavery compliance, which is supplier engagement. So before we get started, I'm going to outline some general housekeeping notes. All PowerPoint slides and a recording of this webinar will be emailed to all attendees next week. The webinar will also be made available on our website at sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the GoToWebinar control panel. So all answers will be sent in a follow-up document at the end of next week. You can also email questions directly to education@sourceintelligence.com, and we will make sure that they are added to the final Q&A document. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce our expert speaker panel. To begin, my name is Jay Sailing. I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm a business development manager here at Source Intelligence, and I run the thought leadership for the ethical sourcing solutions. So first off, we're going to hear from Kilian Moote. An expert on supply chain transparency and legal disclosure, Kilian joined Humanity United in 2015 as the new Know the Chain program director. Prior to joining Humanity United, he conceptualized and led Free to Work, which is a risk assessment and evaluation tool funded by the U.S. State Department. Free to Work focused on promoting transparency in supply chains. And on that note, I'd like to formally welcome Kilian. Kilian, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jay, for that introduction. As Jay mentioned, I'm the project director of Know the Chain. Know the Chain is a project focused specifically on the issue of forced labor in supply chains. We are a partnership between Business Human Rights Resource Center, Sustainalytics, and Verite, and I represent Humanity United, a U.S.-based foundation that's focused on some of the most intractable social problems. What we endeavored to do at Know the Chain was develop a methodology of evaluating companies on their process and practice to address forced labor in supply chains. We wanted to develop a framework that could be applied to any at-risk sector and evaluate them in 7 specific areas that we think are fundamentally important when approaching the issue of forced labor in supply chains. What we want to do then with that methodology is to evaluate companies based on their public disclosure to provide a sense of what is promising and good practice in terms of company reporting and process to address the issue of forced labor in at-risk sectors. To give you an overview of what this methodology looked like, we looked at commitment and governance, traceability and risk assessment, purchasing practices, recruitment, worker voice, monitoring, and remedy. Within those 7 key themes, we had 22 specific indicators and over 48 different points of assessment. We then applied that methodology to 3 at-risk sectors, footwear and apparel, food and beverage, and ICT or high tech. Today what I'm going to walk you through is 3 key themes that we feel like are particularly acute when it comes to developing out a risk assessment process for a company, regardless of sector. What I'll walk you through today is some of our key findings from evaluating 2 specific sectors using this methodology, food and beverage and ICT or high tech. When we look at the two sectors so far that we've published reports on, food and beverage and ICT, what we find is that there's a common distribution across the different 7 themes. Companies in general score fairly high on their commitment and governance and on their monitoring. Where we see lower than average scores are on recruitment and worker voice. I'm going to walk through those themes in more detail today, in particular because we think they are fundamental for any company to consider as developing out a risk assessment process. We see higher than average scores on traceability and risk assessment. We do think that is also fundamentally important for a company to be considering as they develop out a process for addressing forced labor. So I'll also walk you through our findings in that theme as well for our benchmark. Some of our key findings as it related to the ICT sector specifically is we found an average score of 16 out of 100 when it came to worker voice. And these are indicators that I'll go into more detail, but specifically look at information that a company provides to an individual worker in their supply chain, as well as worker grievance systems and overall engagement with workers in the workplace. We saw 46 out of 100 on traceability and risk assessment. Some of these findings were really informed by companies' advanced disclosure on deeper level supply chain issues, in particularly as catalyzed due to Dodd-Frank, a specific law in the U.S. that requires companies to report on issues of conflict materials that might have been sourced in conflict zones. The final area that we looked at that we feel like is important from a risk assessment standpoint is recruitment, and we saw an average score of 19 out of 100 for ICT companies. Moving to the key findings for the companies in the food and beverage sector, we saw a similar score of 43 as it related to traceability and risk assessment for companies in this sector. And we saw a low score as well on recruitment, 10 out of 100. Again, another area for companies to focus on as it relates to risk assessment, and I'll go into more detail there. When it relates to traceability and risk assessment, why is it important for companies to consider different commodities or inputs in their supply chain? It's important to look at outside information or third-party information that will give you a sense of what risks could exist for you. This is one resource created by the Department of Labor, which identifies commodities or inputs in different sectors that have risks to forced labor, as well as child labor. The DOL list, as it's known, has identified 19 different food inputs in countries throughout the world that have a risk of forced labor within them. In our risk assessment process that we looked at for companies and why it's important to actually assess potential risk, we looked at how a company could implement forced labor risk assessment into the actual integration of their supply chain and due diligence process. So it's important for a company to consider what information might there be as it relates to risk that could be integrated into the due diligence and selection process of suppliers. We encourage companies to look at this when they're looking at new sourcing regions or partners before that selection has occurred, or if any changes in the supplier's production occurs that might influence risk. So an example of this might be increase in production volume by a specific supplier, which then might lead to an increase in demand of seasonal or agricultural workers. As it relates to risk assessment as well, it's really important for a company to consider how to engage specific stakeholders on forced labor or human trafficking. This could include individual trade unions or local NGOs and or any policymakers in the individual countries in which the suppliers operate. These individual stakeholders can give you a better sense of what risks are known within the community, as opposed to simply looking solely at information that can be publicly available or captured through desk research. Diving a little bit deeper in another area of our benchmark that we think it's important to look at as it relates to risk assessment is worker voice. We know that 1.3 billion workers work in the agricultural sector globally, and it's known that individuals that work in the agricultural sector, because it's seasonal, a large portion of them are migrants, and it can be fluctuating or piecemeal work, that there are increased risks for these individual workers. So we feel it's important for any company, but particularly those that might be dependent on seasonal work or migrant workers, to take into consideration how to fully incorporate worker voice in any kind of risk assessment process. A few elements that we would encourage a company to consider as it relates to risk assessment and worker voice would be where regulatory constraints on freedom of association might exist for suppliers, and how they encourage suppliers to allow for alternative forms of organizing. We can see that this area directly correlates to risk. If workers are in a work environment where they feel that their rights might be infringed or taken advantage on, or they don't have the ability to voice complaints, there might be a heightened risk of exploitation going undetected. Another area that we encourage companies to consider as it relates to risk assessment is what steps are taken to engage workers outside the contents of the workplace. Traditional monitoring or auditing, which is an effective tool for companies in one regard, it might not be able to capture information outside the workplace, where workers might feel more comfortable or confident in voicing complaints or concerns as it relates to the workplace outside of the contents of where they're actually working. An emerging understanding as it relates to risks of forced labor is that recruitment, or the process by which a worker is recruited into the supply chain, directly correlates to potential risk. This is increasing as workers are continuously more mobile, migrating from one location to the next, and in large contexts for specific work. We've seen this on the rise globally. The ILO estimates that nearly 70% of all migrant workers worldwide are migrants working outside the context of their individual countries of origin. 26.7 of these workers, a million of these workers are in construction, and 16.7 workers are in agriculture. So a large portion of an individual company's potential or supplier's potential workforce might be actual migrant workers. And what happens is when a worker is charged for a recruitment fee to acquire a job, that there is potential that that specific fee can be used against the worker to bond them into a form of exploitation in the workplace. So we really encourage a company to take into consideration the use of recruiters in their supply chain in the risk assessment process. There was a report put out by one of the Know the Chain partners in 2014 that documented that nearly 1 in 4 workers that were in a situation of forced labor in the electronics sector in Malaysia. This rate was even at a higher rate for workers that were foreign, being a rate of about 1 in 3 workers. So what can a company do as it relates to recruitment? There's a few things that we would encourage a company to consider when they're developing out a risk assessment process or a program to address risks of forced labor. One would be look at recruitment fee policy. These policies should reflect potentially an employer pays principle, which is a commitment to fully reimburse of any charges levied to a worker when discovered. Worker fees, when charged, can create potential risk of an individual falling into a situation of forced labor. So we would encourage a company either to fully implement a recruitment fees policy where they would ensure that employees aren't paying the fee, but employers are paying, or at least develop a process and principle around what constitutes a fair fee charge. The other area that we would encourage companies to consider is auditing of recruiters and recruitment agencies. As these recruiters are known to pose a risk to workers and to companies as it relates to forced labor, we would encourage a company to take steps to audit the actual individuals who are doing the recruitment process. This can easily be factored into a robust due diligence process and a mechanism to ensure that any recruiter being used is not going against a company's policy on fees. Any of these recruitment policies and process can be integrated into risk assessment or supplier selection. It's also important to consider training of recruiters, training of auditors, and training of compliance staff as it relates to recruitment and what the company's policies are on recruitment. A final resource here for companies would be to download some of the reports that we have available on knowthechain.org. We have to date released a benchmark for food and beverage companies and for ICT or high-tech companies. We also have a companion resource guide for ICT that not only demonstrates and documents what leading practices exist for companies in this sector, but also provides some specific action or resources that would encourage companies to adopt and provides them with information on how to go about doing so. We'll be releasing our final benchmark report, which looks at apparel and footwear companies at the end of this year, and early next year we'll be releasing companion resource guides for both the food and beverage sector as well as the apparel and footwear sector. And with that, I will hand it back over to Jay. Thanks so much, Jay.
Thanks, Kilian. The advanced approach that Know the Chain takes to industry-specific benchmarking will most definitely improve approaches to mitigating risk in supply chains. I really do hope that we see the numbers around traceability, risk assessment, and worker voice increase in the coming years. So next up, we're going to hear from Kristen Sullivan, who is a partner at Deloitte Advisory. Kristen has over 19 years of experience with Deloitte. Kristen is a CPA, CGMA, and is GRI certified. She began her career with Deloitte in the audit and advisory services practice. She has also served in Deloitte's national office in several different capacities. So among other accomplishments, Kristen has authored a number of publications around the value of sustainability and non-financial disclosure and assurance. This includes conflict minerals disclosure and risk assurance. So without further ado, I will give the mic over to Kristen.
Thank you, Jay and Source Intelligence, for the opportunity to provide a perspective on the corporate approach to modern-day slavery as an increasing area of attention for many companies. So let's jump right in. The global legislative and regulatory landscape in this area around corporate and modern-day slavery continues to evolve as stakeholder expectations are really elevating the issue of modern-day slavery as a top-of-mind issue and risk, and really compelling companies to approach the risk of modern-day slavery in a much more disciplined manner. So leading companies are building anti-human trafficking programs that address the compliance considerations in a complex supply chain, as well as begin to hedge against brand and operational risks. As you can see highlighted, this is all reinforced through the growing headlines around modern-day slavery. In particular, the ILO estimates nearly 21 million people are currently subject to forced labor worldwide, a pretty staggering number. Nearly all of the Fortune 100 companies publicly expressed commitment to ongoing supply chain transparency and monitoring. 150 billion in illegal profits are realized or generated from forced labor in the private sector. Again, further reinforcing the obligation of an organization to bring greater transparency to how companies are addressing these risks in their supply chain. A systematic and disciplined system of processes and controls really enhances the adaptive capacity of an organization to respond to these evolving market risks. And we believe that a very clear four-step process or components of a comprehensive and rigorous process include the following. First and foremost, determining the objectives of your compliance program, really focusing on the applicability of legislative and regulatory requirements, stakeholder expectations, the continuing assessment of the growing sets of and evolving sets of expectations from critical stakeholders, and really focusing on the policy objectives that really align with the culture of the organization and how that should help shape and inform a compliance and due diligence program. Second, really understanding that current state assessment of an organization's approach and evaluating capabilities, as well as looking to benchmark against peers and those evolving stakeholder expectations to really understand the current state. Focusing then, third, on a risk assessment, a corporate risk assessment that's applied comprehensively with respect to human trafficking risks from a design, development, and policy perspective to really get that comprehensive view into the opportunity and really the obligation. And then really thinking about and looking to the company's disclosure program and efforts as it relates to balancing a comprehensive and accurate yet representative disclosure around the efforts and how a company is really dealing with and really trying to address these risks, recognizing that this is a comprehensive undertaking and in many ways challenging for companies. Undertaking an enterprise-wide program to address anti-human trafficking certainly does not come without challenges. As I mentioned, this approach to kind of expanding this broad set of social compliance objectives is quite overwhelming given the complexity of global supply chains. So when we look at some of the key challenges as we talk with our clients every day, clearly as you think about modern slavery risk and anti-human trafficking, there's no clear black and white, widely accepted framework to drive corporate anti-human trafficking activities in the supply chain. There are various different guidelines and standards that are looked to increasingly, but the absence of a very clear look-to framework in many cases challenges companies to understand, am I organizing and defining my program to meet the compliance objective, but really, what does good look like? Similarly, and consistently with those sorts of concerns, that there is an increasingly lack of harmonization, of various legislative initiatives and regulatory drivers, including somewhat differing requirements and ambiguity that again challenge companies to really put that clarity within the program to drive a clear understanding, confidence, and compliance. Lack of established program governance and ownership obligations and therefore allocation of resources. This is one of these areas that is so complex and broadly impacting that it's challenging for many companies to really establish that effective governance that respects the cultural considerations within an organization and across the geographic footprint. And then the difficulty in some of the practical elements of an anti-human trafficking program. So evaluating anti-human trafficking risk at various levels, considering the industry within which an organization operates, the products that an organization is in the business of delivering, geographic considerations as you think about some of the sourcing considerations and exposure to these sorts of risks. The challenge with determining material issues, salient issues, and really that focus on a very risk-based approach organized through that lens of what are the most material or salient issues in this area of anti-human trafficking efforts. Collecting and managing data when you need to think about data that's necessary to help inform activities and drive informed decision making. How do you collect and place reliance on that necessary data to really inform effective decisions? Determining the appropriate remediation. Once you have that data, what are you doing with it? And how are those decisions helping to drive business performance and a focus on the rights holders, so those that are participants in this whole value chain. And then really determining what and how to report when you think about the role transparency can play, not only from a compliance perspective, but how companies are really using that transparency mechanism as a risk mitigation avenue, as well as just an opportunity to promote their social license to operate and promote the understanding more broadly of what an organization is doing to minimize risks in this area. So then as you translate that to the set of expectations, increasingly as organizations are trying to navigate this complex space, and once an organization determines the objectives of this program from a risk perspective, which contemplates the applicability of legislation and regulatory requirements, evolving stakeholder expectations, and those policy considerations, how should the company think about that level of transparency as it relates to evaluating those risks within the company and its broader supply chain? This whole idea of how should that risk evaluation drive company practices, but also the level of disclosure that the company is providing to its interested stakeholders. Designing, developing, and implementing compliance programs based on that risk assessment. So intentionally aligning the evaluation of those risks to the investment and the allocation of appropriate resources to the execution of the program. enhancing collaboration with stakeholders. Clearly, from a regulatory perspective, there's a generally a clearer objective, but as you think about, and as companies increasingly are thinking about those critical stakeholders, the importance of that very intentional and regular cadence of evaluation and engagement with stakeholders becomes so increasingly critical to think about how the organization continues to manage those risks. And then aligning the disclosure approach with those stakeholder expectations, and very much at knowing your audience, knowing what's meaningful to those market participants, and as you think about striking that balance from a compliance requirement perspective to more broadly the needs of the broader set of stakeholders. Emerging from the SEC's conflict minerals rule, which really served as one of these key moments in the market that highlighted the accountability of companies around the impacts of the organization, outside of just the four walls, that the business activities conducted by an organization do bring enhanced exposure and accountability to an organization, and the related required compliance activities. We believe that there's a lot that can be looked to, leveraged from the programs, the discipline, the systematic approach that the companies put in place to drive compliance with the SEC's conflict minerals rule, to consider how to evolve these sorts of compliance risks and focus areas to other regulatory developments, such as anti-human trafficking efforts, and really, as we've learned through our discussions with many companies, can really serve to help break down some of the compliance activities to make them more manageable and digestible when you think about translating a disciplined, established approach to a broader set of objectives or subject matter. Starting from a program that can be expanded is always much easier than starting from a clean sheet of paper. And I think just continuing on the theme of how the SEC's conflict minerals rule compliance efforts by companies can really drive action and really accelerate progress in this area. Many companies, if you think back to the beginning of the conflict minerals rule, many companies suggested it would be very difficult or even impossible to meet the objectives of the SEC's rule. But now, 3 years in, many companies have achieved compliance with the rule's objectives and realized significant risk mitigation benefits. And I think when we think about in general, environmental and social impacts of business practices are prompting, getting the attention of policymakers and prompting policymakers and regulators to focus on an organization's social compliance systems. Again, in this whole realm of that striking that balance between regulation and an organization's license to operate and continue to serve its markets. Investors, customers, and other stakeholders are increasing the level of scrutiny of companies' programs focusing on human rights risks at every stage of the value chain. Again, in this whole spirit of, in order to better evaluate the organization's capacity to respond to unforeseen and evolving circumstances and risks. And again, we continue to see how organizations may view social compliance efforts as cumbersome, or that the continuous regulatory landscape as it evolves as challenging. Experiences with conflict minerals will suggest that these efforts have helped companies improve supply chain transparency and risk identification capabilities. So moving to the focus on perhaps the more practical steps of an approach and a disciplined program around broadening compliance efforts to anti-human trafficking. As I was introducing, a sound social compliance program is built on a guiding framework for developing and implementing processes and controls. It's that reference point, it's that foundation around the discipline that an organization puts in place to really promote the ability for systematic and continuous execution. And recognizing, again, as I mentioned, that there's no current specific or widely accepted framework that drives anti-human trafficking activities as that go-to standard, similar to what we saw with conflict minerals, which was the OECD due diligence framework. we believe that the following program can guide, and the program components can guide in the establishment and implementation of a systematic and disciplined anti-human trafficking program in the context of broader integrated social compliance programs, and really serve to, through a well-documented and consistently executed program, can really serve to position an organization very strongly to respond to, in a more proactive manner, risks that continue to evolve in this broader space. So let me jump into the essential program components, again informed by the perspective that we have from working with companies in a number of these broader social compliance efforts. But what is so critical to the foundation of a program, a disciplined program and comprehensive program, is the establishment of effective program governance and guided by a policy that contemplates the obligations but also the expectations of an organization. So establishing that clear governance structure with the appropriate oversight through a steering committee, the cross-functional representation to bring in the perspectives and the collaboration necessary within an organization to drive the activities and really promote the accomplishment of achieving the objectives that a program would establish. And really focusing, at the outset on the role, as you think about that ultimate level of transparency and disclosure around the outputs of these activities, really contemplating those considerations at the onset and as a part of the program governance definition to ensure that expectations are clearly set throughout the organization and with suppliers. Some of the considerations that we discuss regularly with our clients around this whole program governance and policy setting side of the equation is really how can a company continue to promote more of a proactive approach in this area of supply chain social compliance? Is it an individual policy that sets out the objectives in one particular area? Is there an opportunity to establish a broader, more comprehensive policy that responds to the various different regulatory or other marketplace developments? And I think it really is a function of the organization, the culture, just how the organization typically responds to and manages these sorts of issues. Can that be done through a centralized mechanism, depending on the geographic footprint or the level of decentralization within an organization? But we certainly see a lot of these considerations, which we think is really productive in terms of how companies are thinking about these increasing expectations and thinking in terms of how to best integrate these compliance activities into the normal functioning of the business, so that it is integrated and becomes embedded in the culture and the expectations, versus the bolt-on sort of an approach that does not lend itself to sustained consistent execution. Second, really focusing on the whole training and support and awareness building components of an effective program. I think we saw from a conflict minerals perspective, clearly training was critical to complying with the objectives of the OECD due diligence framework. And I would argue that this whole focus on training and awareness is even more critical as you think about some of the growing anti-human trafficking, modern slavery policy, legislative developments, that the training is central to an effective and well-executed program to really minimize that risk of an organization. So really that commitment to human rights and aligning that commitment to the company culture, recognizing the unique considerations around the geography, the industry that a company operates in, and then that consistent messaging from the top, really building awareness, reinforcing both internally and externally that commitment and the expectations that come with that, and in effect the enforcement considerations that will result to really reinforce the importance of that issue. And I think clarity of objectives is absolutely essential as you think about that training and awareness building and being explicitly clear with all interested parties what the expectations are, so that there's a clear view in terms of how the activity will be monitored. 3, supplier expectations. Really focusing on that relationship and that engagement with suppliers to promote the most effective and responsive sort of relationship in terms of driving the expectations from the company through to its entire supply chain. And that's done in many ways through the supplier code of conduct and really making clear those expectations as it relates to anti-human trafficking, development, social compliance developments, all the way through to introducing terms and conditions that create that legal responsibility in terms of really driving and the compliance approach to that supplier relationship. And I think importantly, it's really through the lens, I think, as we've learned through a number of the opportunities that companies have had as it relates to driving compliance with complex minerals. It's really looking and realizing those opportunities to really deepen supplier relationships and drive greater value from a mutual perspective. Risk assessment and data management, critical from an ongoing risk assessment perspective to think about this broadening set of considerations around human rights and anti-human trafficking in the supply chain, and how does that risk evaluation really drive a consistent approach to defining and promoting the expectations around corrective actions, and ultimately, again, the accountability in terms of really enforcing the expectations and helping to promote that behavior that is consistent with an organization's policy and objectives from an anti-human trafficking perspective. And ultimately, the public disclosure, the recognition that there are a set of clear expectations from a regulatory compliance perspective, from a broader stakeholder expectation, and really trying to balance and rationalize the prioritization of those expectations into a balanced yet accurate portrayal and representation of the performance, and importantly, how the organization is driving performance improvement, and how transparency really enables a balanced view from a reader of this disclosure. And I think all of this, when you think about just these critical components of a program and the importance of well-documented set of considerations around how the organization is meeting these objectives, and importantly, how they're measuring their progress, as well as recognizing the challenges and how they're really going to work to drive priorities in really driving that performance improvement. It really recognizes that organizations outsource many aspects of their business and lose visibility just as a function of those sorts of practices, lose visibility into the comprehensive set of supplier risks, and how can a company take a more integrated and intentional approach around driving that greater visibility, but also balancing it with the opportunity to drive supplier capacity and increased awareness around these issues, and how it can really help them from a supplier perspective manage those risks as well. So it's really critical for organizations to really take a more deliberate and systematic approach around these broadening social risks in the supply chain, while a number of the policy, legislative, and regulatory developments are really driving the urgency around paying greater attention to this program discipline. I think that we are seeing that greater discipline really help companies realize some value and really taking that more holistic enterprise approach, recognizing that there are various different business considerations around a decentralized business model, the various different approach to how an organization thinks centrally about driving business practices. So critical to, again, continuing to really drive those improvements. And then finally, fostering long-term value. I think as we talk with and consider the opportunity to leverage experiences from the conflict minerals compliance practices and lessons learned, I think where I started, the focus on the fact that many companies at the outset of the conflict minerals compliance challenge really were very skeptical that this would even be possible. And I think as we've, again, fast forward 3 years, we've seen that there have been unintended benefits of compliance, of conflict minerals compliance, that I think can be viewed as considerations and can really inform due diligence practices in a broader set of these risk considerations that become so challenging to manage as a large corporate entity. So again, that increased and enhanced visibility into supply chain, which just naturally and inherently enables a better and more effective risk evaluation and mitigation considerations. Really thinking through, how this information can best be put to use and really driving the value of identifying these risks earlier and increasing that capacity for an organization to better respond in a more timely manner and really drive the meeting those expectations of the various different stakeholders. And increased cooperation from suppliers that I think, again, was a clear benefit realized through the conflict minerals compliance efforts, I think can be it's a very direct correlation to the broader set of increasing supplier social compliance expectations that really focusing on the importance of that supplier relationship and the role that the organization can play in helping to drive capacity for the mutual benefit of both organizations. So I think that, again, there's just a number of opportunities to really focus on building further on the experiences from the conflict minerals compliance set of challenges and activities undertaken, and thinking about how that can be leveraged, and really importantly, driving that enhanced confidence by leadership within the organization as there becomes a greater appreciation of the attention around these issues and really the risk considerations and how an organization can best respond to these increasing challenges, and most importantly, think through how the brand and reputation protection, in addition to regulatory compliance, can ultimately benefit the organization and promote long-term sustainability and license to operate. So thank you again for this opportunity to share our perspective, and I will hand it back over to Jay.
Thanks, Kristen. That was a great presentation. I completely agree that putting in place strong expectations for suppliers and using proper data management systems for risk assessment are some of the most fundamental aspects of a scalable anti-human trafficking program. I'd like to take a moment to remind all the attendees that if you have any questions that you would like answered, please type them in the chat box. We're going to consolidate all questions and then release an official Q&A document for everybody to access. You will not only find answers to all the questions, but there will be links to various resources that can further educate you on any topic necessary. I'm very excited to announce our next guest, Source Intelligence's own Jennifer Kraus. As Executive Vice President of Operations, Chief Scientific Officer, and co-founder of Source Intelligence, Jennifer brings over 25 years of experience providing multidisciplinary strategic compliance, EH&S management, and management system services to customers in the U.S., Mexico, Canada, and Central and South America. Prior to co-founding Source Intelligence, Dr. Kraus was president of Global Environmental Consulting Company. Okay, Jennifer, welcome, and take it away whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you, Jay, for that introduction. I'm excited to be here representing Source Intelligence and talking today really about such an important, timely, and certainly worthy topic. I'd like to start by saying it was really excellent to hear Kristen begin the webinar by outlining some program development success models. And Kilian, great way to outline some key risk indicators and red flags of potential human trafficking that's present in supply chains. Here at Source Intelligence, we've spent the last 4 years developing compliance programs with customers of all shapes and sizes. And it's really become increasingly clear that risk mitigation strategies require a company-specific approach. So today, we're discussing corporate-level anti-human trafficking program development. And really the key to developing a robust program is to first understand where the potential risks lie in your supply chain. As you gather more data and information on your suppliers, you're going to start to get a better sense of your overall supply chain health. You can look for inconsistencies in data, compare suppliers on statistics around engagement. You can look at geolocation, supplier response rates. And these basic data points are going to begin to allow you to segment your supply chain based on potential levels of risk. And of course, comprehensive risk assessment is contingent on having proper systems in place to manage data collection and validation for you to draw conclusions that are meaningful. But it's certainly a great place to start. So, I think one of the most interesting aspects of working with customers on anti-human trafficking programs is the opportunity to witness trends in data management and help companies learn to let data drive their supply chain compliance decisions. The data will speak to you, if you let it, and it can be very powerful. As I mentioned before, mitigating risk in your supply chain starts with getting a clear view of your supply chain. Optimization tools like web-based technologies allow you to centralize all of your data in one place and then apply platform analytics, which in turn can generate intuitive dashboards for you to do a more comprehensive supply chain risk assessment. Working with supply chain optimization tools allow you to sort of focus and pinpoint areas of high risk in your supply chain based on the data that you're collecting from your suppliers and vendors. So some key risk indicators like, let's say, inconsistent information can be immediately flagged, and then you have the ability to tag that supplier and more closely monitor that supplier's behavior. And it's important to remember that, the presence of human trafficking has likely a very low probability of showing up in your tier 1 suppliers or frankly even your tier 2s for that matter. So key risk indicators for this start to show up farther up the supply chain once you begin your sub-tier supply chain analysis. And efficient data management is essential at this stage, as the majority of key identifiers with respect to modern day slavery activity are found in these sub-tier supplier analyses. And really, this is where things can get complicated, right? Each tier of the supply chain will need to establish programs or at least a very basic policy that can facilitate, or at least begin to facilitate, the exchange of data and the validation of data. The exercise of sub-tier supply chain analysis makes working off of spreadsheets not just very challenging, but from our perspective, obsolete. So true supply chain transparency is developed through supplier engagement, data analytics, and the process of implementing supply chain systems that are scalable. They've got to be scalable. Supply chain transparency is a continuous process that aims to improve communication, streamline the exchange of data, and give companies the ability to trust that accurate data is driving their supply chain compliance decision. So let me take a moment to outline one of the most important concepts that Kristen just mentioned for us here, and I've spoken about previously, and that is the supplier engagement piece. At Source Intelligence, we believe supplier engagement is such a fundamental driver of risk management that we've dedicated a team that works 24/7, 365 to communicate information up and down the supply chains of the customers with whom we work. And for those of you that have heard me speak before, I've mentioned our supplier engagement team before, and I'm very proud of it. We've invested in multilingual and multicultural individuals that are fantastic with regard to engaging with suppliers all over the world. Utilizing a centralized data management system like our platform, the Source Intelligence platform, allows you to access dashboards that give you up-to-date results on that supplier engagement. Now, I'd like to give you an example of analyzing supply chain engagement from a view here on our platform, on the Source Intelligence platform. So we've got a snapshot of a code of conduct campaign up on the slide for you here. At the top right, you'll see a chart that frankly displays the challenges behind the supplier engagement process. You'll see that supplier engagement actually fluctuates over time. If you utilize a technology tool that tracks engagement, this will allow you to identify and keep track of flags like non-responsive suppliers. It could also help you understand other temporal variations in your supply chain response. There could be seasonal variations, for instance. So the initial boom in response rates, and again, I'm still at the top right here, indicates that proactive suppliers with strong communication strategies and timely response rates are highly visible. And you'll see that at the initiation of the campaign. But after about a week, those unresponsive suppliers begin to become apparent. And engaging with unresponsive suppliers is one of the toughest functions to overcome as an enterprise. Utilizing technology coupled with a 24/365 supplier engagement team can be a very powerful way to overcome this challenge. And here at Source Intelligence, we've got a number of years experience, lots of lessons learned, and we built up some best practices behind the way we do supplier engagement. So if we look now at that lower chart, this displays supplier engagement from a different perspective. The Source Intelligence platform allows you to perform a supplier-to-supplier comparison. So you can set an average supplier as your benchmark and then measure other suppliers against that benchmark, via a side-to-side comparison. The comparison view allows you to measure suppliers on various different categories, like let's say response rates, engagement scores, data accuracy, and other types of variables such as that. The platform supplier analysis puts you in control of your supply chain, and it helps you stay in front of potential risk areas in your supply chain. So as you can see, efforts to mitigate slavery in supply chains are evolving. Trends in data management are moving towards platform technology as a tool for supply chain compliance optimization. There's no doubt that mitigating slavery in the supply chain is a daunting task. I don't think anyone on this webinar today or outside of the webinar will argue with that. But I will say, though, and we're seeing this, companies can put systems in place that ensure a proactive approach that's scalable and, frankly, can yield robust results. So, the last thing I'll sort of finish up with here is I just want to mention that we do have a wealth of knowledge on our website. Please feel free to visit that. You can learn more about modern day slavery there. We've got white papers and webinars that you can access. And I encourage you to stay up to date on the developments surrounding regulations and risk mitigation strategies in this particular area. You'll find some infographics that may be useful, not just for yourselves, but to educate your own enterprise, whether it's senior management or other stakeholders either within or outside of your organization. It's important to understand that how modern day slavery can sort of slip under the radar of many large firms. It's one of those out of sight, out of mind, right? Because it's buried so deep in the supply chain, it's not visible at the tier 1 or tier 2 level. But for your brand's protection, it's important to make sure you do have a comprehensive compliance program, and that program aims to mitigate risk and achieve not just supply chain compliance, but supply chain transparency. Anyhow, those are just the brief words I wanted to share with you today. Again, I appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, and I am going to turn this over back to Jay.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'd like to build on the point that all of us at Source Intelligence are extremely proud of the great work that our supplier engagement team does. They're truly a backbone of our organization. So, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I saw some great questions come through the chat area during the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have the panelists address each question offline and come up with a separate document. Once completed, we'll send the official Q&A document to everybody. I'd like to thank Kilian, Kristen, and Jennifer for sharing with our audience today. The information we took away from this webinar will definitely help companies approach modern-day slavery, knowing that they have a strong starting point with their existing compliance data. This is a very challenging topic to overcome for businesses, but with advances in software tools for compliance optimization, data management, and sector-specific anti-human trafficking approaches, we'll be able to tackle this issue. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email education@sourceintelligence.com. I'd like to mention that we have many additional resources surrounding modern-day slavery compliance and anti-human trafficking. Most recently, the ethical sourcing team created regulation guides for both the UK Modern Day Slavery Act and Senate Bill 657, California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Educating your supply chain is an essential part of a successful risk mitigation program. So I definitely encourage your entire supply chain to check out the Source Intelligence blog, which is constantly updated with current events and best practices behind supply chain communication. I know everybody has a busy day ahead, so I will end things off by saying thank you very much for taking the time to learn more about modern-day slavery compliance, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.